Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dendrite Podcast with Farnham and Saeed. This is a conversation with Dr. Vanessa Taler. She's a full professor in the School of Psychology and Neuropsychology at the University of Ottawa and principal investigator for Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging.
Her research focuses on neuropsychology and cognitive psychology, with a particular interest in language and neurocognitive processing in older adults with cognitive impairments and dementia. She also investigates the impact of bilingualism on cognitive function using behavioral and event-related potentials techniques.
Dr. Taler also works on development of neuropsychological testing materials for early detection of dementia and analyze changes in brain activity associated with cognitive impairment and dementia through advanced neuroimaging techniques. Her work connects psychology and neuroscience, focusing on real-world solutions for aging and cognitive health. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now here's Vanessa Taler. All right. Hello, Dr. Taler. How are you today?
Good, thank you. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thank you for being here today. We are really honored to have you as a guest of our podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Oh my God, thank you so much. How's everything with life? Are you done marking your exams yet or no?
I am not quite done marking. My TA is amazing and she is done marking, and I need to check everything and then submit the grades. So
Perfect.
It is my plan to get that done. For my students who are listening, I guess you'll have your grades by the time you get this.
Okay, perfect. For those of you who are wondering about the course that she teaches, it's what?
So it's GRT, which is a gerontology course, GRT 3102.
Perfect.
And it's called Cognitive Aging and Dementia.
Awesome. The course is amazing. I wish we as a biomed student had that option to take it, because the reason I had no idea what the course name was. And I think Romina also told me she just found out about the course through a friend, and it was just all over the place. But
yeah, it's really, I have a lot of biomed and health sciences students in that class. I always ask them how they find it, and there's lots of different answers. My friend told me, I saw it, I wanted to take, I'm interested in aging. Sometimes, occasionally, they'll say, I found it on Reddit. Apparently, somebody has said on Reddit that it's a good course. So I was looking for a third-year elective for my applications, whatever. I will be very happy to, if anybody has any ideas of how to get people to know about the course, because I really enjoy teaching it, and I like the students seem to enjoy it, especially the science students. A lot of them take it they're hoping to go to medical school. And so I'm very happy to have them, because I get a semester to get them to care about older people and about dementia and teach them.
Definitely amazing. And even I went to one class, and it was definitely my favorite.
You learned about frontotemporal dementia, if I recall.
Yeah, I would actually never forget that part for the rest of my life. So always temporal dementia.
Okay, so now we can start about asking you about the time that you were a student, probably yourself, or even before that. When were you first interested in psychology, and then how did the whole journey start?
So I did my undergraduate. I grew up in New Zealand, and that's where I did my undergrad. And I really like reading, so I started in English literature, actually. And then I took a linguistics course and fell in love and switched my major to linguistics. And so my undergrad is in linguistics, and then with a minor in Spanish. And then I came to Canada for grad school, so I did my master's at McGill, again in linguistics. Sociolinguistics in this case, so how language works in society, how people use it, and that still influences my research a lot. I'm very interested in language. And then I decided, I took a couple years off after my master's. I was working as a research assistant, and then I thought I could do a better job at research than the person I was working for. So I decided to do a PhD, and I really wanted to learn French. Obviously, in New Zealand, I didn't learn any French.
Right.
And I'd been living in Montreal for a while. I didn't really speak French. It's very hard to learn French in Montreal. People answer you in English if you have an accent. So I decided to go to University of Montreal, and they have a program there, a PhD program in biomedical sciences with a specialization or an option in neuropsychology. So I applied for that. My supervisor was still in linguistics, but that was kind of my French immersion course. I lied on my application papers. Sorry, University of Montreal. I lied and said my niveau de français was bon, which was not true at all. I didn't speak any French at all. And that was my introduction to the brain. And I didn't know anything about the brain at that point. All my background was in linguistics.
Yeah. So speaking of language, how many languages can you speak?
Well, I counted 3 so far.
3, yeah, just 3. English, French, Spanish.
Okay. Are you like fluent in all? And
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
My mother grew up in El Salvador, so like I have. So I lived there
okay.
I was living there for a little bit before I started my master's during the Civil War. And
Which one was the hardest to learn out of all 3? I mean, English was obviously your first.
English is
one,
my first language. I think French was harder than Spanish. I found people. So I was living in El Salvador. I was surrounded by people that didn't speak English. So it was
So that
real
helped.
immersion, and people loved it when I spoke Spanish. French is I find I have an accent, and I can't get rid of it.
Right.
And so I sort of I don't know, like.
Well, it's good to have that accent. Like it tells your backstory. Like it adds to the baggage. And
I guess so.
So,
yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily true, or I don't know. If I have an accent, that's kind of, I don't know. I really try to not have an accent.
it depends how you look at it, though. Like
Yeah. I think it does. It tells you. I mean, there's a whole kind of story about how we interpret what it means if somebody has an accent in a language and what the accent sounds like, and there's a lot of information
Like I think it
there.
adds
Right?
to the language. Like it means that there are some group of people from different parts, and they're now adding to this language. It just
Sure,
So-
and languages when languages are in contact with each other, they affect each other, right?
Yeah.
So it's really sort of this is sort of where my interest, like, nice, like you're bringing me to the sociolinguistics, right? So when people are the two languages are kind of coexisting, as you see in Quebec or in sort of eastern parts of Ontario, that you have a lot of English and French, and people switch back and forth. That tells you a lot about how. What the people it sort of has a lot of social information, right? So I know that my grandmother, who spoke 7 languages, and she was of the opinion that if you switched between languages, that meant you didn't speak either language properly, and there was no way. She's like old school European. There was no way to change her mind on this, and I was trying to explain to her that that's really not the case, and it can be, right, if you can't think of a word. But when people are really switching between languages, they're saying something about who they are, and they're saying something to the person that they're interacting with, that we're in the same community. So you see this in, let's say, Chicano populations like English, Spanish, bilingual in the United States, that when people are switching, you're not just giving a message with the words themselves, but you're also talking about, you're telling the person we're part of the same community. Right?
Yeah.
So there's all of this information contained in that. And then you have words that are borrowed. Like we do this all the time, right? Like we do this in English is like such a mongrel of a language, really, right? Like all of the words that we have from all these different sources, that there's like Latin and French, and the Normans were in England for 400 years, or right? And we absorb all of these words, and it's kind of fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
language is such a fascinating topic because it sort of is like the window to human consciousness. It's like this one difference.
Well, I taught a few years ago a course in a graduate seminar in psychology, special topics that was on the psychology of altered states of consciousness. So we talked about what is consciousness, and then how like different states that people can be in. So obviously the obvious thing is like psychedelics, right? Like what happens to our consciousness, theories.
Joe
of
Rogan
consciousness.
mentioned in his podcast.
Joe Rogan.
Our competitor. But I don't know, is it true actually, like psychedelics had an impact on forming the languages or not? Like that's just a myth?
That's new to me, that psychedelics formed language.
Yeah, like people started.
Is that what Joe Rogan said?
Yeah, like you said, started taking psychedelics, and we need to talk, and then I don't know. It sounds so Joe Rogan.
Is that actually something he said?
Yeah.
Wow, Joe.
Yeah, we can include
I
the
can
link
tell
in the
that,
description.
No, I would say that language emerged because of the need for communication. We don't need to take drugs to think that we need to communicate, right? So,
Right.
but that's sort of interesting. So anyway, there's theories of consciousness. And then you can look at different aspects of consciousness and how they're impacted. So, for example, with psychedelics, that you might see that you have this sort of feeling of oceanic boundlessness, they call it, right? So you're like connected, you're one with the universe, but also very negative experiences, or what we call like bad trips, right? Where it's like you start to feel that the world is closing in on you, or you don't know the loss of sense of self, right? So that sense of self is part of consciousness. So we talk about that, but then of course there's lots of other ways that our consciousness can be altered. So we did stuff on sleep and dreams, sleep disorders. It's really interesting. Meditation. So I am very into meditation, and meditation is certainly an altered state of consciousness. Death, near-death experiences.
Oh,
right?
DMT molecules. I'm into that.
So that's we did some stuff on near-death experiences, and what else? There's, because I was always looking for published, like, peer-reviewed papers on these different, so there's a lot on psychedelics and meditation and stuff. But then there's a few on altered states of consciousness in, for example, childbirth, mountaineering, when people are deprived of oxygen, it can get really weird up there. Torture, I found one case study of a man describing, like, out-of-body experiences while being tortured. It's pretty intense. It was just like a single case study. But it's really, so yeah, I have lots of thoughts on consciousness. And then I had one of the students in that class, the PhD students, went on to teach the psychology of death and dying a few times. So he asked me to give a guest lecture on consciousness, as if that's like my expertise, right? And so I'd get up and I'm teaching the undergrads about, it's like, what is consciousness? We don't know. At some point I'm like, we're just meat and electricity. Like, what are we even made of? And it's sort of, it's really actually
existential questions.
That's really, I was just reading a book actually about, so it's a neurosurgeon who was diagnosed with cancer. So he's writing about his experiences. And he's talking about us trying to understand consciousness in the brain, using our brain. And I'd always said, like, this is an article of faith, right? That we can actually understand our brain using our brain. But the metaphor he used, I loved it so much. He said, you can't cut butter with a knife made out of butter.
Oh, wait, is the book named When Breath Becomes...
No, that's Paul, what's his last name?
I think I know
that. I know the book that you're talking about, When Breath Becomes Air. This is a guy called Henry Marsh, the neurosurgeon. The other one is Paul.
Paul something.
It starts with a K. I don't remember.
But that has like the same kind of story. So this guy I think he was diagnosed with prostate cancer and like a little older. Like the one you're talking about, he was very young. He was like in his 30s, I think. I read that book. Like, I have a like weird fascination with death. But this one, he is actually alive. Like the cancer went into remission. But it's sort of interesting, like from a neurosurgeon's perspective, because we're so mature. So he said he started in philosophy, but then he moved to medicine and became a neurosurgeon because he liked it. It was more practical. Philosophy was like, he couldn't get his head around it, right? Philosophy was too hard, so he became a neurosurgeon.
But it stays with you, and like I think it manifested in his book. Like,
but it's really interesting, right? Because there's these sort of different levels of how we analyze this. So when we're talking about consciousness, people always want to find the neural substrates of consciousness, and that's fine. Like, you have your posterior hot zone or whatever. Like, there's different theories about, and it's really important at some level to understand that, even for things like understanding if there's consciousness in somebody who's in a minimally conscious state, or what we used to call a vegetative state, right? Where there's what we think is a lack of consciousness. And then there's these experiments showing that so you have someone, you're trying to make the decision, do we unplug them or not, right? Like, they're not conscious according to all of the experts. And then you put them in a scanner and you say, okay, I want you to, we're going to ask you questions. And if the answer is yes, I want you to think about playing tennis. And if the answer is no, I want you to think about playing soccer. Right? So then if you think about your motor cortex is topographically organized, right? So you can, if you look in the scanner, you can see if it's like which part, whether it's like the arm part or the leg part that's being activated. And like some of these people were able to respond yes, no, even though it was thought that they were like ready to be. So can you imagine? They can hear, just think about this. You can hear, you're in a minimally conscious or vegetative state, and you can hear what's happening. You can think yes or no. You can't communicate in any way. And people are standing around thinking you can't understand, debating whether to unplug you or not.
Yeah.
This is crazy. This is, I mean, anyway, so the neural substrates is like, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And then you can think about it sort of more philosophically, like what are the, conceptually, what is consciousness? And then you can think about it in terms of like so this sort of psycho processing, like sort of boxes and arrows without thinking about like the underlying brain, the underlying neural substrates or like the brain regions that are associated. But we love we love the most reductionistic. It's like, well, what's happening in the brain? That's cool, super important.
Yeah.
But same thing with language, right? So you can think about it like, what is language theoretically? How does it work? Like theoretical linguistics, psycholinguistics, like what are the processes we go through when we're understanding or producing language? And then which bits of the brain are active? These are all valid questions or different lenses on the same problem.
Yeah. But I guess if you want to like reach that understanding, you got to think it as like a more general kind of perspective. I don't know.
I think that all of these, like, these are just, none of them are dependent on, like, in order to study one, you don't require the other, right?
Yeah.
So this is, this is something that I think applies to all fields, right? Of like that there's different lenses of how you can think about what the problem is.
Yeah.
So again, like with my course in cognitive aging and dementia, because I have a lot of science students and they're like, yeah, we know about tau. Like they come in like this, I am a biomed I already know this stuff. It's like, yeah, I'm sure you do know. Like, and I'm like, here's a neuron, right? Like, of course, because it's like some of the students are in like criminology or English lit or whatever. I'm like, this is a neuron. This is a dendrite. This is an axon.
Yeah.
So, but they often say, this is the first time I've ever thought about it in terms of the actual people. So you came to the FTD lecture, frontotemporal dementia, but later in the semester, I talk about caregiving and the impacts on caregivers or the social economic burden, like many things that are kind of more the like mood disorders and cognition. And this is something that you miss when you're just thinking about the cells and the buildup of protein.
It taps into
whatever.
bioethics a lot as well because we're dealing with people. And,
And it's really important to remember that because, and I think like all of the future healthcare workers I have in that class, I hope that they take that through their careers with them, that they remember that whenever they're studying cells, the cells are within the human. Right?
Yeah.
the living being.
The living being. Exactly.
Speaking of psychedelics, what do you think?
Rebecca's like, this is not my expertise.
I love
I'm
that.
very
Do
happy
we have any running research at the moment, like at U Ottawa or anywhere, like at least or Toronto? Because I feel like we need much more effort.
Yeah, so
it's
there's,
not happening,
there's a
like,
new master's program in psychology on psychedelics.
Well, you know what's funny? As an undergrad, we can't really take those.
You can,
Like,
but you have to have like certain criteria to check off. So that
no, you have to be grad student. I actually emailed them. I don't know if they changed the policy now, but
I mean, it's kind of hard because psychedelics aren't technically, what's the word, legal,
yeah, I know.
right? So I sort of think
But
about
if you have like a store in front of Rito and like,
I know. And then they
Isn't
kind
that
of get like rated every so often or whatever. I think about, so it used to be a little different, I guess. And do you know who Ram Dass is? He
No.
was, okay, so he's sort of one of the original quote unquote gurus, like Westerners that went to India and came back. And he came back and he called himself Ram Dass,
oh, okay.
which was, it means servant of God. Right. And
Interesting.
he like
Fascinating.
so he wrote a book called Be Here Now, like in the early 1970s. And he was, prior to that, he was a professor in social psychology at Harvard. I think he worked with Timothy Leary, who is the psychedelics guy.
Okay.
And I think they were the first professors with tenure ever to get fired at Harvard. And so I read like some of his books and he sort of talks about, his name was Richard Alpert at the time, and then he came back as Ram Dass. And he's like, oh yeah, I think Harvard was starting to get a bit worried. This is like in his books, Harvard's starting to get a bit worried because we just ordered like $1 million worth of LSD from Switzerland, and we were just like, they're in some building on campus, like dropping acid, and that was like their
$1 million,
research, right?
That's like in.
I mean, in the 1960s, right? So it's like, so they were just, anyway, they got fired from, even though they were tenured, but he'd sort of realized that he wasn't getting any happiness really from what he was doing. And actually psychedelics are, that's cool, I guess, to see like a different state of consciousness, but it wears off, right?
Yeah.
So his conclusion that he drew was that you want something that's a little bit more enduring, and so the path is kind of more meditation, right, rather than psychedelics.
And also, because I think it's easy to get to that level, you don't really get its worth as like it's for with meditation. You got to practice. It's right after, like, it takes a long time.
Meditation puts you in very altered states of consciousness. But it's more gradual and like kind of organic. Like it's
our body has to use to that kind of level as well, right? We can just go right into it. Interesting.
The effort makes a difference.
Yeah. So he said he gave some acid to his guru. He had some guru in India, right? And he gave the guy acid. And he took it, and he's like, why would I take this when I could just meditate?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, don't take psychedelics, guys.
It's not legal. Just meditate.
All right. So one of the studies that you did was mild cognitive impairments. If you can just define what does it mean and...
What's mild cognitive impairment?
And what was the whole structure of the study in general?
Oh, I have a few studies on MCI. I think this was probably... the one looking at semantic function and mild cognitive impairment. Yeah. Okay, so when you think about as you get older, your cognition can change, right? So we know that even just with normal aging, you start to see some changes in cognition. And some people will develop dementia. So dementia can be defined in terms of both cognitive impairments in different domains of cognition and functional impairments. So people will have difficulty with activities of daily living. It can start with things like difficulties with finances or maybe like grocery shopping, and then it becomes like, as it progresses, more kind of basic things like hygiene and so on. So when you think about it, it's not that one day your cognition is fine and the next day you wake up and you have dementia. You have this sort of trajectory where your cognition is declining. And in 1999, so it's always sort of known, like when you're trying to stage like how severe someone's dementia is, that there was this kind of construct of like questionable or like very early dementia. There's some cognitive impairments, but you don't see functional impairments really too much.
And it's usually a long time, right?
Yes.
Like it's called preclinical stage or something?
Right. So prodromal stage.
Prodromal, yeah.
So in 1999, Ron Peterson published a paper defining mild cognitive impairment. Prior to that, we had constructs like cognitive impairment, no dementia, right? So it's not that people hadn't realized that this state existed, but he really concretized it and developed these criteria. And so people with MCI are showing impairment in one or more cognitive domains. So usually we would define that as something like 1.5 standard deviations below the mean for their age and education. And they have subjective complaints, or an informant does. So they're saying there's something happening, right? I'm noticing that my cognition is declining, but their function remains basically intact. So you can think of it as prodromal or like an early stage, or you can think of it also as like a risk factor. It would be another way to conceptualize it. Not everybody with MCI goes on to develop dementia. So it's not always a prodromal state of dementia. Some people just might have lower cognition, right? It can be mimicked by things like depression. So if somebody's depressed, their cognition will be impacted by that as well. So one of the things I was sort of interested in is we often think about dementia in terms of memory. Not all dementia has a memory component. So for example, frontotemporal dementia, you don't see this memory impairment. You'll see impairment in executive function or language. Feel free to interrupt me to ask me to define any terms that
one thing that was interesting that you mentioned that you defined it based on the mean, but the education level and the age. So what are the different variables that, because it seems to be quite like a vast condition.
Okay.
How do you control for like education, what are the different variables that you have to account for before categorizing people in that?
So I mean, you would definitely want to think about education, age, possibly sex or gender could be important. At some point, it is also clinical judgment is really important. So you're just assessing, so it's not like a formula that you type in like what all the variables are and it gives you a yes/no answer, like the clinician's kind of making an assessment. I mean, I sort of think about this like with, if I think about what looks like impairment, that it depends so much on the person. So some people have sort of very high baseline levels of cognition. So let's say you start out 3 standard deviations above the mean, and then you're 1 standard deviation above the mean. That for you
That
is
still
cognitive
counts, yeah.
impairment.
Yeah,
But
it's so
a-
subjective.
yeah.
Well, how
so
do you
it's-
define that? Like, because I feel like I'm forgetting sometimes a
Okay,
lot.
well, you
and-
don't have MCI.
But like, where do you draw the line? Like,
So that's again a question of clinical judgment, but it would be that the person has the feeling that something's happening, and then you're seeing many people. So that's another construct of subjective cognitive decline. These are people who say there's a problem, and then when you test them, they look fine. Right? So they don't meet criteria for mild cognitive impairment. For MCI, you have to have some objective cognitive impairment. Subjective cognitive decline can be like an early stage, so people with SCD are at a much elevated risk, somewhat quite elevated risk relative to people who don't report any problems with their cognition, especially if they say, I've noticed that my cognition isn't as good and I'm really worried about it. That is like I would be inclined to take that seriously, and that's something that like it's hard. I mean, in clinical practice, what are you going to do about that, right?
And I think particularly if it's prolonged, like not in just I'm not having a sharp day, like I'm not.
You're
hitting
so
chest
right. So
today,
if people report it, so that's one of the research shows that you're ready to teach my class. The research shows that if you report that at multiple time points. So what we call temporal consistency, right? Like consistency over time, then yes, you're at a more elevated risk of declining. So, but then the example I was going to give with people who are at a high level, and then, so it's a decline relative to their previous performance, but they might look normal. That's kind of hard, right?
Yeah.
And so if you can have longitudinal data, that's great. Like if you can see what the person was like 3 or 5 or 8 years ago. But I think about, if I was assessing my dad and he didn't know, so he looks fine on tests, but he didn't remember who the president was in 1977. I'd be worried, right? Because for him, that wouldn't be good, right? But that's maybe not the norm. So you're always kind of trying to make those assessments. So with MCI, what I was really interested in, so we know if you look at memory, there's lots of different kinds of memory. And the one that we usually think about is episodic memory, or like we'll test using, for example, verbal learning paradigms. So I'll read some words to you, and then I ask you to tell me how many of those words you remember. So say as many as you can remember immediately, and then at a delay. So if you're showing low performance on that, then that's not good. But we see, or I might tell you a story and then ask you to repeat back everything you remember about the story. And as people age, there's like there can be a decline in that's normal, right? That's nothing to be worried about. So essentially you're trying to assess the steepness of the trajectory to decide if there's a problem or not. And then I was really interested in language stuff, right? And so normally with older people that don't have any neuropathology, well, they might have a little bit, but they don't have any dementia or any cognitive impairment, their language looks good. People's language doesn't, like you might get a little bit slower. You see declines in processing speed, declines in working memory, like how much you can hold in mind, that can affect how you perform in language tasks. But in general, you're fine. So you can talk normally, you can you know what things mean, right? You can understand language normally, and then when you start seeing changes in what people know about the world, what we call semantic memory, that doesn't happen in normal aging. So I was running a study with people with MCI. This was years ago in my postdoc, and we were asking them to define. We'd give them novel noun-noun compounds, so 2 words together, and then ask them to tell us what that means. So, for example, apple monkey. It's like, what's an apple monkey? And so some people might say, everyone knows it's a kind of monkey, and it's not a real thing, right? But I'd be like, if there was such a thing as an apple monkey, tell me, what would that mean? And some people might say, oh, it's a monkey that eats apples, right? So there's like a relational kind of
connecting the words
association.
together.
Or they might say, oh, it's a red monkey, like it has the color of an apple, right? So they do. So I was interested in how that changes as people develop dementia. And one of our examples was leopard shirt. And so everybody says that's a shirt that has a leopard pattern on it, right? Like they're pretty much in agreement about that. And then we had this person with MCI and he said, oh, that's a green and orange shirt. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. So you think leopards are green and orange? Like he knew there was something about color, but it was so it's like, oh, there's something with they're losing these semantic features, right? So that's why I was interested, and that's where the paper came from, assessing semantic problems in people with mild cognitive impairment. So we developed this battery with different tasks assessing different inputs. So different input and output modalities. So showing them pictures, telling them words, asking them to produce verbally, write, point at pictures. So testing all of the input and output modalities to see if there's a problem with their semantic knowledge per se. And so that was the paper I think that you read is the English battery, but that's because I'm interested in bilingualism and especially like French-English bilingualism in Canada. So we have published that also we have a French version of that battery.
Is it as good as the English one? Like how?
Yeah, so this is really, it's
I'm
really
sure
challenging.
You put a lot of effort to
I
that.
hope it's as good. It's with a colleague. I'm working with a colleague, Laura Moneta, who I actually did my PhD with, an Argentinian woman who's now living in Quebec City. She's at Laval University. So we've been working together for 25 years or something. And so that's where it's hard to recruit monolingual francophones in Ottawa.
Right.
So we recruit our monolingual francophones in Quebec City. And it's really challenging clinically to assess in languages. We have a lot of tools in English for assessing different cognitive domains. And people have this misconception that you can just translate them.
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
It does not work like that. You have to validate it in the other language. So in English and French, they're pretty similar languages, like in the broad spectrum of languages in the world. So the tests work okay. We have like one of the classics is a naming test where I show you pictures and I ask you to tell me what that is. And the Boston naming test is the one that people use the most. It has 60 just line drawings and people have to say, and it starts easy, like bed and flower, house, and then it ends up like the hardest or like abacus, protractor, right? Like none of my young adults know what that is. Trellis, which is like the thing that vines grow on, like up the side of a house, like it's sort of patterned like this.
Yeah.
And so we do it in French. People always perform better in English. The test was developed in English. So now we have one that we have a naming test that we developed specifically for English, French bilinguals and for francophones. But the Boston naming, we tried to do that in Arabic.
No, not it.
Disaster. It was a disaster. So the very first word is bed. And one of the things about naming tests is that everybody has to agree what the thing is called. That makes it easier, right? So in English, you see a bed, it's a bed. There's no other word for that thing. And then in Arabic, I guess there's two words that's studied and then another one that starts with T. I'm like, I know like 4 words in Arabic and 2 of them mean bed. So the very first item is harder in Arabic than it is in English. And then I had a student who told me that her grandmother, so she's Lebanese, I think, and the grandmother doesn't speak English. So she only speaks Arabic and she was being assessed. Her cognitive function was being assessed and she did a naming test. And I was like, did the neuropsychologist speak Arabic? Not that you can do it in Arabic, but like, how would you even? Oh, no, they got in the aunt, like they brought in the woman's daughter. And so she'd say that's what it is in Arabic. And then they'd ask the daughter, was that correct?
Oh.
I was like, oh, we have a lot of work to do if this is like how we're assessing. But like, what are you supposed to do? You're trying to assess someone.
Yeah.
And I guess
You
we
don't
can
have tools.
Yeah, asking the question about, well, what is the effect of the language itself? Like, does it make any effect on the cognitive
So the
aspect?
language itself certainly makes an effect. The tests are, you can't have a test, you have to translate and adapt. So part of the problem with the Boston naming test in Arabic is that a lot of the items, there was no good word in Arabic for them. It would be the same if we took a test that was developed in Arabic and tried to do it in English. It wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
So you have to translate it, you have to adapt it, you have to consider, even in English, we have different dialects. So there's one item, cactus, and in, I guess in the Southeast, like in Arizona, like certain areas of the U.S., they have to accept saguaro, It's like this Spanish word, but people call it a saguaro, right? So we have some French tests, but they were normed in Europe, so they don't necessarily work perfect in Canada. So so this colleague of mine, we're sort of trying to publish this stuff of testing in French, and she's like, I have clinicians calling me up and asking me, please, can you hurry up and publish this? So we'll put it all like open access for people to be able to use it, like just download it.
No, it's definitely really challenging because I feel like each language has its own vibe and way of thinking, because like you see some people are really funny in one language, and when they start speaking another language they're not funny at
Again,
all.
that's a question of its own. Like, are we the same? Like, do we have the same personality in
So
different languages?
interesting. That's so interesting. So my mother is, as I said, she grew up in El Salvador, but her parents were British. So she's perfectly bilingual.
Right.
And she and I always, because my dad is, his first language is Serbo-Croatian. So they decided that they were going to speak English to me and my brother, because there was, and then my grandmother's Russian. So it was like there was Russian and Serbo-Croatian and Spanish. It was too much happening. So they were like, okay, we're just going to do English with these kids, which I've never, if you're listening, mother and father, I've never forgiven you for raising me monolingual. But they decided they were going to speak English to us. So I knew that my mother spoke Spanish, and like I mean, she spoke Spanish, like I had it around me. But then I went to Cuba with her, and so it was the first time I've been in a really Spanish-speaking environment with her, and she's speaking Spanish to people like on the street or whatever. Her whole body language, everything changed. I'm like, who are you? This is not my mother. I find this unacceptable. So some people, I don't know, like you can have different, and people depending also where you learn the languages and where you use them. So you both speak Farsi, I guess?
Yeah, Farsi.
And you speak Farsi with your families?
Yes.
And then you speak English in school?
Yes. Sometimes I speak English with my brother too.
With your brother?
When we are trying to be,
Not
fooling
what your
around and
parents
stuff.
understand. Right. So, but you're like using using it like sort of to
Or even
imitate, like,
sometimes
the mood,
both.
right?
Yeah, like we use Farsi, half English as well sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's so,
It's a mismatch,
and then
I
there's some people who, but they're like more or less separated, right? So you have home is Farsi, school is English, more or less, right? Whereas if you think of somebody who grew up, let's say, with a francophone father and an anglophone mother, and then they're at University of Ottawa, they're going to have English and French, or they work in the government, right? They're going to have English and French mixed together in the two contexts, or in all the contexts. They're going to be using both languages.
Yeah.
That's going to look really different, right? Than
So it's really personal about the person of what exactly, like, is it linked to what, I guess, circuitry of the brain, or like what memories?
So memory, the circuitry is probably more or less the same. But yeah, we used to think that the two languages were in different parts of the brain.
Not like that.
I mean, it's so fascinating when you look at when people when they have a brain injury and they're bilingual, what happens? So they develop aphasia, or like an acquired language problem. Like it could be expressive or receptive. What happens when you're bilingual? It can be like, so back a million years ago when I was in my master's at McGill, I had a professor called Michel Paradis, who was he was a bilingual aphasia guy, and he developed this test called the bilingual aphasia test, where it was like for all different language combinations, and he would tell this story about this woman that he'd assessed who had, let me see if I can, we're going back a few years, but I'll see if I can remember it. She was Moroccan, I believe, so she spoke French and Arabic, and she had a motorcycle accident or something. Anyway, she had an acquired language deficit. And so day one, she woke up and she could speak French, but not Arabic, but she could translate from French into Arabic.
Oh.
Day two, she woke up and she could speak Arabic, but not French, but she could translate from Arabic into French. And then day three, she woke up and it was like the first day. So she was so this is alternating antagonistic bilingual aphasia, they call it, right? So as one language is doing better, the other language is affected, and it's like going back and forth. So antagonistic between the two languages, right? And it's like,
It's like they're competing.
what? How do you, I mean, exactly. And they do, because when you're bilingual, so as we're speaking in English here, you both have your Farsi activated for sure. Like we have our languages. So this is part of the hypothesis of, there is some data suggesting that bilingualism can serve as a form of cognitive reserve, or kind of like buffer you against neuropathology. So you have like later onset of dementia. It's very complicated. There's data in both directions.
Yeah, because that's one thing, because I feel like when you know more languages, it takes more time to sometimes like think, oh,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
need to
Well,
speak.
because they're competing.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you spend your life doing that, right?
Yeah.
Like you're like, okay, I have to inhibit whichever language I'm not using. So you have all this kind of cognitive exercise. I'm putting like quotation marks around that, but this cognitive exercise that means that you're more practiced in these what we would call executive control mechanisms. And so bilinguals, especially as they get older, may be better in executive control. I mean, it's very complicated. This is I'm making it like a little bit. That's kind of like the simple story. The data are all over the place with that. People argue about it.
But is language like is it just a tool for us to communicate, or is it like just that the next step after thought, or is it like, does it originate from that? Like if I'm thinking something, I can be using like Farsi or English, but the origin is the same, or are they like slightly now different?
Oh, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Again, people argue about this. Like, I would say, first of all, I believe that thought can exist without language. So if you look at somebody who can't express, who has an expressive aphasia, they still think, right? We can scaffold our thoughts with language, but like the thought itself, in my opinion, is not dependent on language. But when you're talking about, is it coming from the same place? So this is really a kind of complex question. Like you can think about, well, there's all of these semantic features. So let's say you know the word table, and you produce your word table in English or in Farsi, but everything that is a table in English isn't necessarily, like it's not going to be perfectly mapped onto what a table is.
Now talk about something that is abstract, then it's
Oh,
all
well,
over the
then it's
place.
like, oh my God. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that like you have your concepts and there might be overlap between, let's say, a concept of liberty, right? To choose like an abstract concept, or even love, right? So love is like a concept we learn when we're really little, early age of acquisition. And I don't know that it overlaps perfectly in different languages. So you can have, or a word like game, right? So you have your basis of what a game is, and then there's like the sort of the core concept of game, and then lots of variants on that might fall under the category of game, and that's not going to be exactly the same in the two languages. So I think probably you have the concept before. I don't know. I mean, but it must be interactive, right?
And the
Because
thing is,
like what the words you think of are going to impact like how we can change. So there's all this really interesting research on like, does the language you speak change the way you think, right? And I remember learning about this in linguistics, right? When I was a little baby undergrad, just like you are now. And I learned about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this was these two researchers that had done work in the 1930s, I guess, talking about differences. So they had, one of them had a doorman in his building who was Hopi Indian. And so that was this is the researcher's subject that he's asking him about the concept of time. And then he had this whole theory that in Hopi, you don't have future and past tense, and so they think about time differently. That was like the origin of all of this. And then, as I recall, he didn't actually speak Hopi, the guy that worked in. So it's like there's some problems with the research. But there's and then for a long time, we just were not supposed to think this at all. And then it's kind of been reinvigorated a little bit. So even just things like how we see color, right? Depending where your boundaries are of color in your language, you can you might report things as different or see things as different. Directionality can be impacted evidently by language. There's like sort of it's one of the areas that people get pretty
And it's
emotional
not just
about,
the
like when
language,
they're
because it gets like tangled in the way of life and in the culture of that specific places. It's like they both are shaping each other. So
that's like we sort of talk about these things like they're totally
Let me
separate.
ask you this then.
Yeah, go.
What do you think about what Elon's is doing in Neuralink? And do you think would there be an action?
I'm almost certain as soon as you said Elon that I'm not going to like whatever it is.
But
What's
do you
he
think-
doing in Neuralink where he's like torturing monkeys without ethical approval?
I think we had the first trial in Canada. Like
I know.
2 weeks
I
ago.
really want to know like where they got the ethical
So do you
approval.
think?
But anyway.
Yeah. Would there be a day that we can just communicate without using words, or?
might.
You mean like telepathically?
Yeah. With Neuralink.
I
or
mean,
whatever
like if you'd asked me in 1920 if I thought anyone was ever going to walk on the moon, I would say no. So it seems inconceivable to me. But like the world's a weird place, man.
Would that be through Neuralink or?
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know enough about Neuralink to really like opine.
What I knew so far, it's more physical. Like if someone has problems with like sight,
Yeah.
and they can make that connection. Like if the problem is the connection between neurons, like I can't move my arm,
Yeah.
but it's the neurons are there, but the connection is gone.
Yeah.
They can fix that. But
I mean, that's incredible in and of itself.
But
Can they
language-
actually do that? Is that true? I mean,
I think
has that
it's
been
the
published
path.
anywhere, or is it just like on Twitter?
I
we've
just
learned?
Mostly
heard
it's
him,
media,
like,
I think. It's just like showing
Well, you have
off.
to understand about media. What you have to understand is that, like, they, and especially now, we operate on a click-based
Yeah.
revenue model, and there are no ethical restrictions in terms of how you report science in the media. So I know, like, I get emails all the time, like, look what I saw in the paper, or like on whatever website, BuzzFeed, or whatever, and I'm like, I need to go read the original paper. Often they'll go to conferences and just find a poster that hasn't been peer reviewed and then report it. Like, we've changed the world. It's like amazing the way that things can be represented in the media. So I haven't seen enough to know what
Right.
he's actually doing. And
But-
like I said, I get really caught up on like all the monkeys that died, and I want to know like what ethics board approved this. Like, I'm really stuck on that.
That would definitely be something. But it's kind of like sad too. Like if you think about it.
To torture monkeys to death.
Yeah,
Yes, I
but
could
not
agree
only
more.
that, the whole theory of like how everything is just a perception and how we see the world in just like molecules and like.
But
in
that's
the-
very reductionistic, right? Like, remember I was talking about that at the beginning? It's like, yeah, that's one level of looking at it, right? But it's not the only thing. Like, yes, we see the world in molecules, but also there's emergent properties from the
Right.
molecules.
like
right?
it's just like a
and there's
pile of Legos
consciousness.
because-
If you can explain consciousness to me in terms of molecules, well, no one can, right? So, like, there's so much that we don't understand. We think that science gives us the answer to everything, and science is great. Believe me, like, I'm very happy that it exists and we can use
Being
it
a
to do like
scientist.
incredible things.
Yeah.
But there are questions that it's not equipped to answer at this
There
point in
has to
time.
be
So,
the other
like,
side
yeah.
as
So
well,
don't
yeah.
be sad. I mean, molecules is one level,
Okay, hopefully.
but there's still consciousness.
I don't know. There's like this saying, like
Humanity,
the
and,
more
like,
you know.
how do you
the-
extend? Yeah. The more you know, the less you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But also, people think of science as like this very dry thing. I don't think of it as way. I mean, it can be even romantic. We can try at least attempt to, because science it's a method.
Yeah,
It's a
of course.
scientific method.
Said is a
That's-
romantic guy, by the way.
I can tell. I agree. I could not agree with you more. It is simply a tool or a method. Say, okay, well, and there are things that so you have to be able to observe, you have to be able to replicate, right? Like, there are certain scientific principles, and that's great, and it's a huge advancement for humankind that we have this tool. But I find that, so I made a little joke in my class that I then had to clarify to the students, because I was talking about the biopsychosocial spiritual model of aging and disease. So I was like, okay, the biopsychosocial, now students, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, students were not prepared to. I had a student once who wrote in the anonymous evaluation, this is back when you used to write it by pen, and the student had written, why is this professor teaching us all this psychosocial crap? This is in the evaluation. Aging is a biological, all capital letters underlined, process. And I'm like, that was less than 15 years ago. And now the students are like, yeah, of course we understand that bio and psycho and social all influence each other. But when I bring in spiritual, like, I don't know, sometimes, and I'm like, I'm not saying that God is intervening. Like, this is not what I'm doing in this class, discussing like whether there's a God or not. But your beliefs about spirituality and about religion and about God can impact your biological and your psycho and your psychological and social levels. And the students are kind of like, why is this? So I made this joke because I was like, well, look, I don't know. And personally, I was not raised religious. I was raised in the Church of Atheism. And then afterwards, some students came up and they're like, really? What's the Church of Atheism? I'm like, no, it's a joke. But it just means that I was raised an atheist. But what I also sort of mean is that people worship atheism in the same way that they worship religion, right?
It functions as
Yeah,
just
it's kind
another-
of like, oh, I'm
yeah.
just going to worship science. That's like my new idol, right? And I'm agnostic. I don't know. I don't think, how would some little human know like how things work? But people really, and so you have the kind of new atheists that, right? Like we have our Dawkins and our Sam Harris. You know, like the new, so there was the four horsemen, Dawkins, Hitchens,
Oh yeah,
Sam
I've heard
Harris, and Daniel Dennett, right? The,
Fierce, they're very
new,
fierce. I listened to many of their like debates, and Hitchens, like he was just
well, we're not getting into geopolitics on this podcast, but so they were sort of the four horsemen of the new atheist movement. But I always found it to be, I mean, Daniel Dennett literally said we should get rid of the word atheist because it's pejorative. People use it pejoratively. So do you know what he wanted to replace it with? You know, you listen to all the debates.
No, I didn't miss that
Brights.
one.
He said we should call atheists brights.
Right.
I'm like, yeah, because they're so much smart. Like, really, Daniel Dennett? So the arrogance that came with that was really, like, I think, like a turn off for a lot of people. But also, it meant that we're just replaced, like, because it's like we want something that we can, like.
But I think it's in the long run, it's good to even have people like that, and because then it becomes like a
100%.
you can observe that and you can see
Yeah.
that, and then like that one is it's trying to break everything.
Yeah,
so
sure.
that's like the first line, and
Yeah,
then
we don't
after
necessarily
that,
need
yeah.
to break everything. Like,
Yeah.
that makes me think of the, like, what is it, the tech bros say? Move fast and break things. And I'm like, look at the world we're living in now. Thanks, tech bros. Like, you did this. So, yeah, it's good to, yes, you want to break out of the mold, absolutely. But we want
At
to,
what
I
cost?
don't know. At what well, it's even just like, like, I think that it's really important to have humility about our understanding of how things work. So, like, I have faith in the scientific method, of course, and I also have humility about whether I know how anything works, really.
Right, yeah. Because it's also like we say we believe in something, but in reality, you know, it's different. But also like the whole belief system, I'm just wondering, how does it affect the cognitive impairment testing? Because sometimes if you tell
These questions.
someone like, I don't know, like I feel like I have this problem, but if I think I do have this problem, I might not put my 100%. But sometimes if I'm not told that I have this problem, I might just not be able to like make excuse and work harder. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Because belief is not just I believe in God or I don't believe
No,
in
no,
God.
no, of course.
It's a
Yeah.
whole. It's tapped into what my personality is, like who I am. Like I believe that I am this person.
Right.
Or I have this worldview of the world. Like so this is.
yeah, but I
Right,
mean,
and
certainly we don't.
what I believe
yeah.
about myself
Exactly.
impacts like how I so then you have the concept.
But we
of
don't have
stereo-
like the test of like seeing the God. But in case of like cognitive diseases, we can like assess that, like how effective that is to be able to like, okay, these person, like these people know that they have this problem, but along the run, how does that come into the equation? Like some people know they have this problem, some people don't. And if you don't tell them, obviously, if the earlier you caught someone who has these kind of disorders, the better, right? But if you don't tell them, how does that come into the place?
So should we tell people if they have MCI? Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
I mean, it's going to depend on the person, right? Like
right.
how much that's
especially
gonna
the
impact them.
placebo effect, which is another
Yeah,
thing that
and
I'm
the
really interested in.
nocebo effect.
Nocebo.
Right?
Yeah,
So
the worst thing.
the placebo effect is, I mean, we treat this like a nuisance variable, right? The placebo effect, that is wild. Like we can change our physical functioning by believing something. I give you sugar pills and like your pain goes away. That's crazy,
Yeah.
right? And then the nocebo, you think this is poison and you get sick from like sugar pills. So I think that we don't think about that enough in terms of what it means about the power of our minds to impact things. So yes, you make me think of, or what you say makes me think of the concept of stereotypes, right? So if you believe that you're going to do poorly, so let's say I am giving a math test and I have half men and half women in my class, and I'm like, here's this math test. By the way, I just want you all to know that like men routinely outperform
Yeah.
women on math tests. Then exactly, I will get that effect. Whereas if I don't say that to them, then like they perform the same, right? So you can see this. There's some data with older people suggesting that they their gait changes or they don't do as well in cognitive tests if you prime them by showing them words like frail or like elderly, or I mean they're like some people don't think that effect. We have this replication crisis, right, in
Right,
psychology.
yeah.
So it's like, has this really been replicated adequately? I'm not sure, but that idea for sure exists. And so what you tell someone about how they fit in the world and what their role is and who they are.
That's
It becomes
Yeah.
who they are.
So you think about the responsibility of being a parent, right? That you're like forming this little person's idea of who they are in the world.
How many daughters you have? One?
Just one.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's she feeling about the whole neuroscience and psychology? She like asks you a lot of questions?
Funny. She's like doing her undergrad in psychology and
Oh, wow,
linguistics. And I was laughing so much and she's really interested in bilingualism. She's doing some work in a bilingualism lab.
Well, it's the first time that we're seeing, because like we ask every guest that we have, and in most cases there's like this not friction, but this difference that.
Oh no, it's like I cloned myself, and I found it really funny because when I was really very pregnant, I was teaching a course in psycholinguistics at Concordia in Montreal. Like I was. As I was entering it, like I was so pregnant that at the end, as I was entering the final grades, I went into labor while I was entering the grades, and I was like, and I just handed in my PhD thesis 3 weeks prior. So I handed in my PhD thesis, finished the course. I was so pregnant at the exam, and then like went into labor. I was like, I better get these grades in because it's not happening afterwards. So I finished entering the grades and then went and had the baby. And then she's decided she wants to do psycholinguistics. I'm like,
Maybe that's
did you
the reason.
decide in utero? Like you just heard, because their auditory system is developed, right? I'm like, you heard the psycholinguistics lecture.
So it's already in the class.
It's like she's already taken the class. So yeah, she's doing the same thing as me, basically.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess that makes you proud.
Sure. I mean, I told her she should do whatever she wants. Like, you want to be a performance artist. You want to be like, as long as you don't become a hedge fund manager, your mother will be proud of you. And do whatever makes you happy. And I guess that's what makes her happy. So it's nice. We can like talk about linguistics at the dinner table. You know?
That's good.
That's a fascinating topic, particularly at the dinner table. Yeah.
Let's see. I mean, we talked a lot. We covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I was not expecting to do psychedelics.
Yeah. So let me ask you this.
The blue.
With languages that are more complex or harder.
That's not a thing, but okay.
Okay, so we cannot say like some people are smarter because they have like a harder language to learn?
I would not ever make such a claim. I think that there are languages that are harder or easier depending what language you're coming from. So for me, for example, I didn't have too much trouble with Spanish. It's like not that different. And then when I learned French, I already spoke Spanish, so that helped a lot. Then I'm trying to learn Russian right now. That's like a little harder. But then if I tried to learn, so I was like, I was actually just talking to someone and I was listening to music in Arabic and he's like, do you like the words? I was like, I don't understand the words. I don't know any Arabic. I'm like, if I had 10 more lives, I would spend one of them learning Arabic because that's how long it would take me coming from English, right?
Right.
But if you speak a language that's closer, right? Like it's to do with the proximity. So Russian is harder for me. I know some Croatian, so it helps a bit. But it's like hard.
That's
Privyet. Hello means it's hi. Very good. And so it's like sort of, I know a little bit of Croatian, so that's like definitely helping. But if somebody speaks Czech and then they're trying to learn Russian, that's like much easier, right? So it's not that there's harder and easier languages. It's just like you need to think about how people very much have this concept, like they will come and tell you that some languages are harder than others, and I do not believe that. So you have different types of grammars, of course, right? Like it can feel really hard to learn Russian because you have all these cases and you need to learn like how the word, like what ending to put on the word and stuff. But if that's part of your language system, you're not going to have trouble.
It's interesting to think how old this is, like like this tree with all the languages, like when they branch off, like
from Proto-Indo-European,
exactly.
like all,
like it's not as difficult. Like I don't think it would for people who speak Farsi, because Farsi is also like an Indo-European language, so it has similar. Yeah, it has. It's like.
I don't know that.
People think that it's similar with Arabic. They have influenced each other.
I'm sure at a vocabulary level.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
But
people say Persians are like on weed and Arabs are on cocaine when they speak. That's the reality. Because Persians have that like soft, very calm
Very chill way of talking.
I don't know if that's true or not. So let me ask you this.
I'm not touching that one.
Since you're an expert on linguistic and bilingualism, if someone wants to learn a new language, what kind of advice would you give them?
Immerse yourself.
Okay.
Get a boyfriend that speaks that
Okay,
language.
that's actually really, really good advice, because my cousin, she's also Iranian, obviously, but she told me, like, right in the beginning, I was like, her name is Shadi. I was like, how do I get better speaking English? She was
Get
like,
a girlfriend who
yeah,
only
that's
speaks English,
it.
obviously.
And that's how it
That's how
happened.
you did it. Yeah. That's how I learned
So
Spanish back in the
shout out
day.
to her.
I got a boyfriend
Yeah.
who only spoke Spanish. And then I learned like pretty good Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, but I mean, essentially you need to be incentivized
Right.
and to be immersed. So the more
To have the need of actually
to have the
speaking.
need to speak it, and then also to have like a lot of exposure.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
Read, try and so like I'm doing Duolingo, which is fine as far as it
But
goes.
it doesn't do anything.
But I mean, like for sure, like I can understand quite a lot now. I don't know that I could like speak that much, but you also like watch shows in that language. Like I find like a lot of people, everywhere in the world, it's like, oh yeah, I speak English because I like Friends.
Friends, yes.
Everyone loves Friends. Why? I don't know. Anyway, so it's like, oh, everybody learned English from watching Friends. And you can read books in that language, listen to podcasts, like whatever. Just like get as much exposure as possible.
Right. What about Alzheimer's Society, CLSA? Are you still involved in that?
And the CLSA?
Yeah, and what is-
absolutely, yeah. So
what
the
is the main
CLSA is the
focus right now?
Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. It's a big study, Canada-wide. We have a data collection site here in Ottawa that I run. So it's following 50,000 people aged 45 to 85 at baseline over 20 years. So we started and we're finishing up follow-up 3. So we have 12 years of data collection now. And it's collecting it's such a cool study actually because it's collecting all different types of data on the participants. So I'm the head of the psychological health working group, so I care about the psych measures and cognition, but there's also a lot of lots and lots of questionnaire data, social networks, retirement status, demographic stuff, and then we have physical measurements, so like bone scans, carotid ultrasound, vision, hearing, blood samples, so we have genetics, urine, and then the study itself, it's not a normal study in the sense that there's no research question we're trying to answer. It's a data platform. So all of these data exist and any researcher in Canada can apply and you make a data access request. You say what question you want to answer, what data you need, and you can access, it's a $3,000 access fee. As someone who's spent like most of my career giving a huge amount of time to CLSA, I also pay the data access fee. Like I don't have any privileged access to the data.
I think that's how you keep it running. Like the goal is to make it as
well,
prolonged as
it's
possible.
funded by so that the data access fee barely covers like what it takes to get. No, it's funded by like CHR and CFI and provincial and lots of different funding. It's pretty expensive to run a study like that. Imagine 50,000 people. So there's 30,000 that come to the data collection sites and then 20,000 by phone. So we have a broader representation across Canada. And it's so now we're incorporating microbiome MRI. There's a subset of people who are getting MRIs, and so that's funded by the Weston Foundation, and it's going great.
Interesting.
It takes a lot of my life, but it's a really I like it kind of conceptually and for trainees, by the way, for PhD students and postdocs who want to write about this, you get the data for free if you're a trainee because we
Well,
want to
there you go.
help trainees. So if you want to do a thesis about CLSA data, you can get those data. For
Have you used the
free.
data yourself? Like,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So is it the one that you use within your own lab? Like the one?
So my own lab, it's two different. So I have my own lab where I'm doing all the bilingualism stuff, and then
Okay.
like CLSA is. They actually are my lab is at the Briere Health Research Institute, and now at CLSA and my lab are next to
Right.
each other. So I'm kind of watching both when I go.
I see.
So what do you do now in your lab? Like what are the different research?
So I had my lab is we do behavioral and EEG, so electroencephalography, looking at mild cognitive impairment, language processing, aging. We have a meditation study, so like looking at we get young adults who've never meditated before and get them to meditate or just like listen to a story as a
Interesting.
control condition. So we're writing that paper up now. We saw like some differences pre-post and brainwaves and cognitive performance after like 1 12-minute meditation in like young adults with no meditation experience,
Could you
which I
talk a
think is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
Right?
Would you speak more of meditation? Because I think like when we think of it, there's this like stereotype, like, I don't know, sitting with your, hands, like it's not,
Yeah.
I guess it's not like that, or at least it's not just that.
It's
So,
not just that. So
yeah.
like I think the classic thing is that people always say to me, I can't meditate. I just always have things in my brain. It's like that's actually called being human, and you're still meditating even if you're like, so the idea is just that you're not attaching to the thought, and you can be, I mean there's different styles of meditation, but the kind of classic mindfulness, so you focus on the breath, your brain goes off of course, and then you bring it back, goes off again, you bring it back, you try not to attach to any of the thoughts, it's like clouds passing or whatever. So the idea of not being good at meditation, the stereotype of like, oh, I can't empty my mind, so I'm not meditating. And I'm like, I bet even the Dalai Lama is like meditating going, I wish that monk would stop breathing so loudly, right? Like we're
Yeah.
humans in the end.
Well, I actually was wondering about that, and one of my friends suggested me one strategy. Once you're meditating, trying to breathe as much as you can, as deep as you can.
Or
so
just
you
normal
just get
breathing.
fainted.
Yeah, but that's not, you don't need to.
Does
so-
that help, or I don't know? Like, is that effective meditating or
One
no?
way, if it-
Oh, if you try to like overload
Like
your brain with oxygen and get faint?
Yeah, I mean, like really, like real, because like it's hard to like focus on the breath. But imagine you're really trying to breath. Like once you're even breathing out, do it to a point that you're just gonna die, and then
I don't
know.
know that I would necessarily do it that way. Like I would think rather it's sort of just you can place your attention on the beginning of the breath and then the end. So one analogy that I've heard is it's like ice skating, that it's like you push and you're like focused on, and then you sustain the attention.
Okay.
And like you just are very gentle with yourself as you start thinking about other things. It's very like challenging to, but it's great. It like changes your brain quickly.
yeah,
in,
because
like,
I
a few
think
weeks.
there's
the idea
also
of meditation is
yeah.
sustaining attention. Now,
That's one
how
type,
to get
yeah.
to that is,
Yeah, that, I mean, like, so you can do this sort of attentional where you place the attention on your attention, and then people do better in sustained attention tasks, and they start to show like more gray matter density and frontal cortex and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Like it's really like quite beneficial. Longer telomeres,
Yeah.
more telomerase activity. It's worth it, and it's really so. I think that is really a disservice that we've had of thinking that it's supposed to be that your brain is totally empty and otherwise you're doing it wrong and there's no point. That's not like the case
not
at
how
all.
it is.
No, it's really like your brain goes. So I did a few years ago one of those 10-day Vipassana courses. So you just start in meditation for 11 and a half hours a day, and you get up at 4:30 in the morning. It's like rough, and you don't have, like, forget computer or cell phone. You don't have a watch. You don't have books. You don't have pen. You don't have paper. It's just you and your brain.
Oh, wow.
And you can't talk to anyone else. Not only can you not talk to anyone else, you can't make eye contact with anyone else. It's
Really?
just you. And
I think the first couple of days must be hell.
yeah, the first
Trying to-
was 10 days, and it's a lot. It's a long.
How do
10
you
days.
sign up for that thing? I'm
Oh,
interested.
there's one in Montebello that I did it in New Zealand, but there's a
Okay.
center in Montebello. Just like
Montebello?
Google Vipassana.
Okay.
Vipassana. It's people. I mean, there was one girl there who just like she couldn't stop laughing, like
Oh, wow.
hysterically to herself. It was very like you saw people having like weird things happen.
Here's what I'm gonna do: take that program and then take psychedelics.
You'll be just the same, only like more you.
I don't know. Doesn't it prepare you to take psychedelics in some way?
How so? I mean, I don't know, like the
question.
experience of taking psychedelics, I think is very different for different people. So like You have people who have really bad trips, as I was
Yeah.
saying, and then other people that have like kind of blissed out
Mm-hmm.
experiences. I wonder, I feel like people who have a meditation practice might have a different type of experience taking
That could be a study.
psychedelics. Yeah, I'd wanted to do a study. I should look into this again. Just going to the Vipassana Center and like recording people's brainwaves before and after the 10 days, because I'll tell you, like, you feel weird at the. It's like all your like dopaminergic system is different or something. I'm like, I remember like going and it's like, oh my god, everything. Look, oh my god, a squirrel. I mean, I was in New Zealand, so there's no squirrels, but I'm like, look at that tree. Whoa. Or like one time we got carrot salad in our buffet, and I'm like, there's raisins in the carrot salad. I was like so happy about the raisins, and it's like, I mean, I like raisins, fine, but
not that much.
But not that much, right? It's like your brain just like gets very altered by doing that. So how it preps you for psychedelics, I don't know. I'm sure it's
Right.
like it might change something.
Well, meditating definitely plays a role in preventing those cognitive disorders.
Maybe, and certainly plays a role in being more accepting
Right.
of what's happening.
Okay. What other factors play a role? This might sound a little bit cliche,
like,
but
what should we do
Is
to
it
age
just
well?
Is it just about like doing puzzles or?
I mean,
getting-
the evidence with doing puzzles is like a little bit equivocal. So it makes me insane, like how you'll get, I mean, so many ads. Lumosity, you know, this program Lumosity, they actually had to pay a bunch of money for like false advertising. So they always get some 20-year-old model and put a lab coat on her, and she goes, I'm a neurologist, you should buy Lumosity. And then people pay all this money for it.
And it's like you get this monkey task on the phone.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely convinced that like there's the evidence for, so puzzles, fine. I mean, if you like it, do it for sure. What do I recommend? So diet and exercise are important. So I have like opinions on this, right? But social isolation is like, so there's prevent or modifiable risk factors. The Lancet Commission has published a few reviews on this. The estimate is something like 40% of cases of, we could reduce incidence of dementia by 40% if we eliminated all of these modifiable risk factors. So the things like traumatic brain injury, really big one is hearing function. If people like hearing is really associated with dementia, so you want to, from a practical perspective, you don't want to be socially isolated. You don't want to be lonely.
It's definitely a big thing. Emotional
Sense of
support.
purpose seems to be important. But the stuff with diet and exercise makes me a little bit insane, because I'm like, you should eat salmon and blueberries. So what I always say in class is, what I want you to do is go to the supermarket, find the most expensive food you can that many people cannot afford, buy that and eat it. And then that's going to be good for your cognition. Or, I really recommend that you have a life where you have enough free time and money that you can afford to go to the gym on a regular basis.
Right.
And then I think that we really have a problem with the way that we think about or air pollution. It's like a new one that we think about. And it's like, well, air pollution is, again, like there's like social determinants of whether people are exposed to air pollution or not.
Yeah.
And so we love in our society making things the responsibility of the individual. And in my opinion, this is not the strategy that is optimal for population health. So what I classically say is, I'm like, if I could give you my number one piece of advice for healthy aging is try and be born to parents who have money.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely important.
But do you know what I mean? It's really, so, I mean, there are things for sure that we can do, but I think that we need a more kind of a broader approach to this than just making individuals. And there's like a huge amount of misinformation, and people are very scared about their changes in their
It's like
cognitive
definitely
function.
it's diet and exercise, but can I afford? Like, do I have the time? Do I have
the time?
The
Do I
energy?
have the
Do I have the resources?
the time, the
Well,
resources?
do you think
the
you're
money,
doing
the
enough
energy?
exercise or no?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Do you go into the gym a lot?
I go to the gym and I lift, bro.
Okay, nice. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the timing is really important. Like myself, been slacking off the gym for like a month now, and
Terrible.
you know, the
But it's final
finals.
exam, so-
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely hard. Last year, I was more focused on the gym, and I got lower marks. But this time was the opposite. So I
There
don't
must
know.
be a balance.
Oh, that's
There's
sort of
no
interesting.
balance.
Yeah, because
I
I,
don't
mean,
think
the
you
thing
can.
is that your cognition is going to be improved by like physical exercise, right? So
Yeah.
you need, you need
But
to find.
does
But
it
I
in
mean,
short
depending
term?
what you mean by balance, right, or by focused on the gym. So
Yeah.
when I say I get enough exercise, I go work out like 4 times a week, and I don't feel like it's necessary to go and lift heavy weights 7 days a week. So like
Right.
it depends, like I guess what people are doing, and for me, like that keeps me. It's also really important for mood, of course, right?
Right. Do we know what type of exercise has the best effect, like lifting, or is it more cardio based?
So there's lots of data suggesting like I would say both are important, and they have different. So lifting is really important for bone health, for example, and or like weight bearing exercise is important for bone health, and we know that falls and like broken bones are really a big a thing that can really impact us later in life. Cardio is great, like as well for cognition. What people don't talk about as much that I think is really important is flexibility and balance.
Right.
It's really important. If you want to be able to walk up the stairs without holding a railing. You want to be able to, when you're driving your car and you need to check, be actually able to turn, right? You want to have good balance when you're walking so that you don't fall. And we don't really like necessarily think about that so much. We think about like, and especially people think about it often in terms of aesthetics, right?
Right.
It's like, oh, I want to look jacked or like be thin or whatever, like the whatever the norm is that you're trying to adhere to. But that's not the only thing that we need to think about as we get older. So
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I personally like doing weights. I think it can, depending how you do it, it can increase like flexibility and balance as well, depending what exercises you're doing. So that works for me, but everybody's going to have different things that they like to do. And I do also Qigong, which is kind of like Tai Chi, but
Okay.
not. So Tai Chi is like a martial art,
Yeah.
right? So this is like the medical version of that, like
Oh,
the
nice.
Chinese medicine version. It's like, I really like it, but it's, and
So you can
that-
fight, basically.
No, because it's not the martial art, right? So
It's more on the
the
meditation side, I think, as well.
yeah, so there's meditations associated with Qigong as well, like a different sort of type of meditation.
Okay.
But yeah, I do that as well, and I think that that's pretty good for flexibility and balance too. But we think about this again, it's like, I think a reflection of our individualistic society. So even when you think about meditation, it makes me like a little bit insane also how
Yeah.
people think about this, because we think about it as a way to optimize ourselves. Like all these tech bros, again, these tech bros, the bane of our existence, are really into self-optimization through meditation. No, the point of meditation is to let go of the ego and to like attain higher consciousness, like not to lower our blood pressure, increase our cognitive performance, or like make our prefrontal lobes better. Like this is really, and then, you know, like the Jack Dorsey, who used to own Twitter before it
Oh,
became
yeah.
X and went to Elon. He went off to do one of these Vipassana courses, and he did the whole thing with like some watch that's like tracking. It's, Jack, this is not the point. Right, so it's like, look how optimized I am, and so I think that it's the same with like any of these traditions. We have to like treat it with respect, and I really think that like we would benefit a lot from thinking about ourselves a little bit less, and
Right.
sort of taking it in a broader sense.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you this now. Since you're doing research and teaching, which one is your favorite, and what are some of the challenges with them?
Oh my God, I mean, I love them both. I think.
First of all, you're a great prof.
Thank
I
you
have
so
to be honest with the audience. The one time that no, you're so down to earth, and not all profs do that.
Blushing.
It's just crazy that how that the relationship you make with the students, it's so supportive and so comfortable that they can just be able to learn, you know? It's not about
So
like,
my goal is for them to be able to learn, and so so I'll start at the beginning, like, and talk about research and teaching separately. So I love both. I refuse to choose my favorite. I feel like I must be the luckiest person in the world to have this job, and I get paid like pretty well to do whatever research I want, and then go and talk to these students who are like enthusiastic and passionate. They want to learn. I get to, and I really am like extremely extroverted, and I very much like people. So like I come in and I'm like, look at all these new people like that I get to meet every semester, like a whole classroom full of like people, and it's going to be great. And the it's like a privilege
yeah.
to be able to teach them and talk to them, and then they're listening and interested in mostly, not necessarily always, but mostly in what I have to say. And I don't view it as, so especially with the course that I just taught, the cognitive aging and dementia, as I was saying, I don't know if we were recording when I said this, but I have a lot of students who want to go into healthcare in some capacity who are in that class. And so it's really kind of my opportunity to teach them something that I hope is going to have impact on a lot of people's lives in the world as they kind of go. They're going to be working with a lot of older people, whatever aspect of healthcare they go into. And so my view of how I teach the class is that I want them to stay in the class, and I want them to learn the material, and I don't really I'm not concerned about what their grades are too much. Like
Yeah.
I'm not feeling like, and because it's an elective, right? Like the vibe is very different than if it's a required course. Like they have to want to be there because they
Yeah.
could just drop the class. And I want them to stay so that I can show them all this stuff. So why would I not create a classroom environment that they want to stay in? And why would I want to get up and have them all hate me, right? Like
Yeah.
why, I would say, why would I be mean when I could just be nice, right? What's the point?
That's a great
So-
question to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they sort of like, I mean, at first they don't know, right? Like it's very funny with each new group of students. They're like, does she? I'm like, here's your study guide. It's all going to be fine. Like, is she for real? Is she going to, what's she going to do in the midterm? And it's like, oh no, okay. Like it's actually, I'm like, no, I genuinely like want them to learn and succeed. Like, why would I not?
Yeah. Because sometimes those things kind of prevent you from the time that you have in the class and, you know, be able to learn and everything, that competing against like your peers sometimes.
Oh
It's
yeah,
like that a
that's
lot,
really
you know?
like I see that a lot. Like that's sort of challenging. So I think in my class that isn't the case because I'm not curving. So
Yeah.
like somebody else doing better is not going to make you do worse. And yeah, and I try and like I record and like provide PowerPoints and whatever because I'm like, okay, students have all kinds of stuff going on in their life. Like it's really easy to forget all of the things that can be going on in people's
Yeah.
lives that might prevent them from coming to class, or like they could be having a very bad week for reasons that are more intense than anything I've experienced in my life. So like, why would I don't know, like have the slides, like just listen, let's have
Yeah.
a conversation, and I want to hear like what they have to say too. And they know, this is the thing, is a lot of them I mean, they've all had different experiences than me, so they bring things to the classroom that I don't know, so I learn from them as well. And they all have their discussion posts. That the amount that I've learned from what these students write in their Brightspace discussion posts, like recommending books or like finding articles talking about their own personal experiences, they know lots of stuff I don't know, so I get to learn that too.
There's some profs that they don't know what discussion is in the bright space still to this day.
Well, we all have our differences.
Or they that's not a tool that they choose
use, yeah.
to use. Like that's, I mean, I only started it in the pandemic. I used to have small group discussions in my classes before, and then the pandemic has changed how students are.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And
yeah.
now
It's a
they're
big shift.
it's
yeah.
starting to come back to how it was a little bit before, but they were very much, I'd be like, talk to your peers, and they'd be like, what? No, I can't talk to people. It's like, I can't, like, so it's really, and I mean, the other thing is that I was really sympathetic to that because I have a daughter who was like in high school for the pandemic, and I saw like how stressful it was and how
yeah.
much it impacted. So I'm always kind of aware of what's happening.
So what advice
On
do
the
you have
student
for
side.
students trying to navigate their undergrads or
talk to your professors. So I tell my students at the beginning of class, I'm like, I record everything. You don't come to class if you don't want to. I'm not going to force it. Why would I want you here if you hate it and you don't want to be here? But then don't come ask me for a reference letter or like to volunteer in my lab if I can't pick you out of a lineup. So, and I'll have students saying, oh, I didn't get a chance to talk to any of my professors in my undergrad. I get that. Students are scared to go and talk to their professors. It's the worst thing that can happen. They say no, right? Go talk to your profs. Go to their office hours. The office hours are for you. I call them student hours, actually. I'm like, I'm not in my office doing important office work and you're disturbing me. Literally, this is the time I set aside for students to come and talk to me about whatever. It doesn't have to be about the class. And I recommend that you do that and because especially students that want to get into research, it's hard. There's a lot of students that want to volunteer, many more than like the number of volunteer spots we have available. Like I understand all of those challenges, but if I know a student and they've been in the class and they've done well and they've come to talk to me and that's going to be someone that I feel like I might be able to have a spot in my lab doing honors, right? Like I know in biomed it's optional.
Yeah.
And I really recommend to do it. You keep your options open if you're doing honors work. And just remember that everything is impermanent, right? Like it's people will. I mean, as you get older, it gets a little bit easier, but we take things really seriously. We get really stressed out. We think that's the end of the world,
But
when
it'll
it's
pass.
not. Everything is impermanent. So.
Yeah.
That's it's okay, and like it's fine. If like one of the things I have to say, being in research, is the amount of rejection is amazing. Like papers, grants, like so the difference between people who do really well and people who don't, I've been told consistently, is not how much you get rejected; it's how much you apply. So, just ask. Just apply. Just go talk to your profs. Just go, like, do it. I try and set it up. I know that there's students who so let's say, for example, with grades, that I'll have students that come and say, can you do some reweighting? And I will do reweighting. Like if somebody really bombs a midterm, I'll do some reweighting. But then at some point I'm like, what? I'm just rewarding the students who are willing to come and ask me. And the students who don't feel confident enough to do that are paying the price. So now I just do it routinely for everybody. I'm like, I have the same rules and you don't need to ask me because I don't want to benefit students that have like a certain kind of approach to their grades. But at the same time, having that approach is really beneficial, right? Like if you're willing to go and ask. So.
Well, Dr. Taler, it was such an honor to talk with you today. We really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you
It's
for
my
what
pleasure.
you're doing.
I really enjoyed it too.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in. In this episode, Dr. Taler shared her journey into cognitive aging and bilingualism research, her work with individuals with mild cognitive impairments, and insights into maintaining cognitive health. She also discussed bilingualism's fascinating effects on cognition and practical advice for students interested in her research.
This is a Dendrite podcast. To support it, please share this episode with your friends and anyone else who might be interested. And now, let us leave you with a quote by Noam Chomsky. Through language, we don't just describe the world, we shape it. It reflects and influences the psychology of individuals and societies, revealing what they value, fear, and hope for. We hope you enjoy this episode and see you next time.